Hardware synth setups are a lot of fun and they're great for sitting down and jamming, but building one can be quite difficult. But don't worry, all of this will be explained in today's video, and I will not only go over what gear you need, but also how you set it up and also how you expand your setup for that time when you inevitably want to buy a new synth. And the setup that we're gonna end up with will look something like this. So we have a main sequencer, a MIDI controller which controls the sequencer, we have a mono synthesizer for bass and lead sounds, and a polyphonic synthesizer for pad sounds. But we won't start with this setup. Instead, we'll start with the most basic setup and then level it up, adding more gear, complexity, and also more fun as the setup grows. And when we get to the fifth and final stage, it's gonna look kind of crazy and there's gonna be a ton of things here on the table. It's also going to be a little bit of a cable nightmare, but don't worry, I'm going to take you through all the steps here slowly so you don't get overwhelmed. And please watch the entire video because there's a lot of information packed into it. And a big thank you to Novation for sponsoring today's video. I wouldn't have been able to make such an in-depth video without their help. And at the end of the video, there will actually be a troubleshooting guide. So if you run into any trouble, just reference that. Level 1. To build a hardware synth setup, the first thing you need is actually a sequencer. But sequencers do not make any sounds by themselves. So I would recommend using a groovebox with sequencing capabilities. This will save you a lot of money because a groovebox works as a standalone instrument, and you can, for example, use it for drum sounds in your hardware synth setup. Now, the reason why I'm recommending the Circuit Tracks as a great starter option is because it has two built-in synth tracks. It also has two dedicated MIDI tracks for controlling other synths or other gear that uses MIDI. And it also has 4 sample-based drum tracks. And also a bonus is that it's battery-powered, so you can take it with you on the go. Making music with the Circuit is simple. You have 2 synths that you can select here, and you can play them. And then you have 2 MIDI tracks and the 4 drum tracks. You also have a master filter that can cut the higher frequencies or filter out the lower ones. And for the 2 synth tracks, you have 8 encoders that lets you change up the sound. And this is how simple it is to make a beat. Select an empty project here, go to Synth 1, find the bass that we like, we can put it down like so, and we can go here to drum 1, kick. We can take this hi-hat here, shorten it down, pitching it up, like so, and it's very playful. You can just add in notes wherever you want and see what sounds good. Something like this maybe, and then you can record in some automation. And we can add in some reverb. So you go here to Effects, select a preset for the reverb, and then you use the knob over the track in order to add in some reverb. And this can also be automated, so we can record it. And there's a delay. And now we can add in the second synth. And in order to get a longer pattern, you can just hit this button here to make it 32 steps instead of 16 steps. And of course we need some reverb. There's of course a ton more you can do with circuit, but it really is this simple. So now that you know how the circuit works, what else do you need to make this setup work? Well, you need a pair of headphones or a pair of speakers. I would go with headphones because basically any old pair will do. And you also need some way of recording the results, because while you can save the jams on the circuit, you can't export them using the circuit. You have to record the audio somehow using the stereo output, the two mono outputs on the circuit. But I'll talk more about recording options later in the video. Level 2. So the next step on this journey is to add in the bass station 2. In terms of cables, you just need a cable that looks like this. So it's just a mono cable. You need a standard DIN MIDI cable as well. And very importantly, a MIDI cable does not transmit sound, it transmits data. In order to connect things, you go MIDI out from the circuit into the MIDI input of the bass station 2. Then we take the main audio line output here from the bass station into input number 1 on the circuit. And because I've set it up correctly, it triggers the sound of the bass station. But in order to set it up correctly, you hit Shift and Setup here. And then by pressing each of the tracks, you can see which MIDI channel it's sending to. So Synth 1 is sending to MIDI channel 1, Synth 2 to MIDI channel 2, MIDI 1 is sending to MIDI channel 4. Whatever synth you're connecting here, it's gonna have a MIDI channel assigned to it. So you will need to change that to the corresponding. So if we have MIDI channel 4 here, it needs to be MIDI channel 4 on whatever you're connecting here. So here you hit Function and MIDI Chain, and you can see it says 4. But there is one more step to the setup, and that's in the mixer. So in the mixer view, we have levels for each of the tracks. But since MIDI channels doesn't emit any sound by themselves, this instead controls the inputs. If I turn down the level here, you don't hear anything because we're controlling the level here. So that's the second thing you need to make sure is working. And that's how simple it is. And now we can make some music with it. Now this combo has one more trick up its sleeve, and that is that the MIDI tracks have these 8 encoders that you can use to control the sound of the bass station 2. Now if you are on a MIDI track, you can hit preset, and here you can save different presets for the MIDI tracks. So preset number 1 is the bass station. Let me just show you how easy it is to get one of these presets. Enter Novation components. This is the software or web UI that you will use to interact with not only the Novation circuit, but also the launch controls that I'm going to show you later. And it's very simple. You connect your device using USB, then you can use it to update, for example, the firmware. You can use it to fill up the circuit with new samples, change out the preset synth sounds, and you can use it to create new MIDI templates or load one of the pre-existing presets. So here I'm simply sending a preset to one of the 8 preset slots on the circuit tracks. But of course we have the knobs here on the synth, so why do we need it over here? Well, because we can record it into the sequencer. And did you know that some sequencers can actually record knob movements from external instruments into its own sequencer, but the circuit tracks cannot do that, so you need to use the macro knobs. And we can of course layer in sounds from the circuit itself. And I know I will get a question like, why start with the circuit tracks and not a bigger workstation like an MPC or Machina? And the main reason is that the circuit tracks is just way more jam friendly. To help you understand what's going on, I've made these very simple drawings, no AI, just me and my poor drawing techniques. And here you can see the signal flow. The blue arrow represents the MIDI output from the circuit into the base station 2 or whatever synth you're connecting, and the red arrow represents the audio being outputted from the synthesizer into the circuit that acts as a mixer. And I would highly recommend writing down the signal flow of your setup as well as what MIDI channels you're using for what piece of gear. Now, if the base station 2 doesn't seem fun for you, there are several other mono synths to choose from. For example, the Korg Monologue is very affordable, or the East Beast from Cre8Audio. Those are two synthesizers that I highly recommend. Level 3. Once you have a circuit and one additional synth, I would add a MIDI controller into the mix. And you could go for the Launch Control XL or the smaller LC3. Now, as you can see, the main difference is that we have the two rows of knobs here and these buttons here, one row of buttons. Here we have dual rows of buttons and the faders and an additional row of knobs here. Otherwise, in terms of functionality, they are very similar and also easy to set up. So MIDI out into MIDI in here. And this particular preset for the circuit gives us control over the delay. We have reverb sense, we have panning, we have levels, we have mutes. We also have two settings here for the filter. But what is the point of adding a MIDI controller? Well, it adds more hands-on control, meaning that you don't need to be in the mixer view here, for example, to tweak the mixer, because you can be tweaking it over here and be somewhere else over on the circuit tracks. Let me give you an example. So while I'm controlling the mixer with my left hand, I'm actually switching patterns and creating a new pattern from scratch that you can't hear, and then I'm gonna mix it into the groove that's going on, creating a little bit of a variation here live on the fly. I'm recording automation for that synth part while I'm controlling the mixer, and you couldn't do this at the same time without a MIDI controller. But in order to make it work, there's a few things you need to know. Firstly, you need to set up the controller to send the correct CC messages. Most synths, grooveboxes and samplers can receive and send CC messages. It's basically a number between 0 and 127 that corresponds to a certain function on the device. For example, the filter cutoff knob might respond to the CC message 74, for example. But this differs from synth to synth. There are some conventions, but you have to actually look it up in the manual. So in components, you basically create a custom mode that you then save to the launch control. And a custom mode means that you can click any of the knobs here on the launch control 3, for example, and faders on the launch control XL. Then you set the CC number, a minimum value, and a max value. And then you need to choose what MIDI channel to affect. And one MIDI port actually equals 16 MIDI channels that will be important later. And setting the correct MIDI channel is super important when dealing with multi-channel devices like the circuit tracks or a Digitakt, because they use multiple MIDI channels. Often it's one MIDI channel per track of the device, so you need to set it up correctly. But thankfully with the launch controls there are actually presets for the circuit tracks but also other devices, so you can simply select them, send them to the launch control, and then you're ready to go. When we're connecting a MIDI controller to the circuit, we get an additional MIDI connection. There's also something called Midi Thru, and it has to do with passing along MIDI data from the input of one device to the output or dedicated through port. And this is how you chain devices together using the through output.
And because we're going to use the MIDI outputs on the circuits as actual outputs and not throughputs, we will not be passing along the MIDI information from the launch control to any external instruments. So in this configuration, you don't have to worry about the launch control affecting any synth connected to the circuit.
Level 4. Now it's finally time to add that polyphonic synthesizer. And a polysynth is a synth where you can play chords and melodies with overlapping notes, something you can't do on a monophonic synthesizer. And here you have a choice to make. Either you add a polyphonic synthesizer with a mono output. So don't confuse this with monophonic and polyphonic. Mono output means that the synth has one output for its sound, so it's a mono source, like the Korg Minilogue, for example, or the Sequential Fourm. Or you add a synth with a stereo output, like the Minilogue XD. It has a stereo output because the effects on the Minilogue XD are stereo. And you can, of course, take a synth with a stereo output and then just run one cable, so making it mono. But if it has built-in effects, the effects will be mono. So if you want actually a stereo synth with stereo effects, you need to add a mixer. More about that later. So because the circuit has two inputs, I would actually suggest going with a mono synth. So a polyphonic synthesizer with a mono output. And in my example, I will use the Sequential Fourm because I really like it. But if you want a more budget-friendly option, you could go with the Korg Minilogue. Setting up a polyphonic synth with the circuit tracks or any groovebox or sequencer is basically the same process. You take another DIN MIDI cable, plug it into the output of the circuit tracks, into the input of the form. You hit Shift and set up MIDI 2 for the second MIDI track. 1, 2, 3, so it's MIDI channel 3. You set this up to be MIDI channel 3 and receiving MIDI on that channel.
And you use the same unbalanced instrument cable that we did before.
Oh, and also, you can very easily, if you want to save some money, just remove the Launch Control XL, and you can go with the smaller Launch Control 3 instead if you want to. So now we can use this row here for level control, but you could set them up to control whatever you want. For example, the effects, if that's something you want to control using the knobs here. Now let's bring in the bass. Say I want to use the keyboard of the form in order to record into the circuit tracks. Now the simplest way to do this is just take another MIDI cable, plug it into the output of the form, and then into the launch control that should make it so that it feeds the notes back into the circuit for recording. And to make something like this work, you need to make sure that the MIDI out port is actually sending MIDI.
So here I've recorded the chords I'm playing on the form into the circuit tracks.
And adding in some bass and some effects, it's starting to come together.
The lead sound is coming from the internal synths of the circuit. The bass station 2 is doing this whooshy effect sound. The form is doing pads, and the bass is the circuit's own synth as well. When you're adding the polyphonic synthesizer, you get another MIDI connection between the groovebox and the synthesizer, and you then get an additional audio connection between the synthesizer and the groovebox, sending the audio into the circuit that acts as a mixer. And if you want to use the polysynth as a MIDI keyboard, you then get an additional MIDI connection between the polysynth and the launch control that then feeds that signal back into the groovebox.
Level 5 and beyond. So what if you want to expand your setup and sequence more than 2 synthesizers at one time? Well, on the circuit tracks you can actually do that, but wait, you said it only has 2 MIDI tracks. Well, yes, but you can use tracks 1 and 2, the synth tracks, to sequence external gear. All you have to do is turn down the level. Of course, you won't have the additional controls that the circuit has, for example, using the knobs to control an external instrument. But Bo, I hear you say, most sequencers only have 1 or 2 MIDI outputs. What do you do once you want to expand beyond 2 synthesizers? How do you actually control them using MIDI? Now, this is where a MIDI splitter comes in. It takes the signal from one MIDI out port and basically splits it. Now, you're still limited to the 16 channels of MIDI of that one output, but it means that as long as you have sequencer tracks for it on the circuit or whatever sequencer you're using, you could theoretically sequence up to 16 external synths, as long as each of those synths just use one MIDI channel. Okay, so now things are starting to get pretty intense here on the table. We still have the circuit as the main sequencer, but we have taken one of the MIDI outputs here, the one that went to the base station too, and then it's inputted into the input of the through box or MIDI splitter. Then we are sending a couple of MIDI signals here from the output through the through box, being split here out into the drum root impact, into the base station 2, and into the protein from Waldorf. And the polysynth is still connected to the second MIDI output of the circuit, tracks. Now I need to introduce a new concept of MIDI clock. Basically, the idea that we can use a master sequencer to clock and sync an external device so it runs at the same tempo as the main device. But that doesn't mean that we're sending any MIDI note data to the drum root impact. So we don't actually need to have sequencer tracks for the drum root impact because the drum root impact has its own sequencer. So when I press play here, what we're listening to is the drum beat from the drum root impact, and that is because we're sending clock, basically the BPM or tempo of this device, and transport, the start and stop, from the MIDI output of the circuit into the splitter and then into the drum root impact. We're still using MIDI track 2 in order to play the polyphonic synth. And MIDI track 1 to play the base station. But what's new is that we're using Synth 2 in order to play the protein. So we go to Mixer and I've lowered down the level of Synth track number 2, and then it's set to MIDI channel number 2, and the protein is set to MIDI channel number 2. But we cannot add the internal effects of the circuit because the audio of these two devices are actually being routed to this mixer over here. So let's go over the audio routings really quick. I still have the form and the base station being routed into the circuit tracks. Nothing has changed there. But the output of the circuit tracks is being routed into the mixer, and the mixer is being routed, the master output of the mixer, a stereo master output, is being routed into a recorder. I go stereo out from the protein into the little mixer here, and I go mono out from the drum root impact into this little mixer here. And we still have the launch control over here, connected to the MIDI input of the circuit tracks, acting as a mixer. I think it's really at this point where you should be careful not adding too many new things at once because it will get really overwhelming. Now there's one really important thing that I haven't mentioned that we need to talk about, and that is actually gain staging. Audio levels can be too hot, and when they're too hot, they distort. Start with the level on the device itself that is sending to the mixer or to the groovebox. Start with that level control over here,
don't go too hot. I would say like go 12 o'clock, maybe a little bit more, and then see how hot it gets when it gets into the mixer or the groovebox and go from there. So start with the source device, then set the levels on the mixer. So we can start with the drums and then bringing in the bass. And then we could bring in the protein. And a vocal sample here on the circuit. And now we bring in the form. And you can hear, if you listen, it's distorting, and that is because we're running it too hot into the circuit. So you can hear now how it's a lot better.
Once you start adding in more synths, you will likely need a mixer and some way of recording your synth jams. And here there are so many ways to do it, there's no one best way, so I'll explain a few of them. Option A is to get an audio interface for your computer with enough inputs for all your synths. Now this is often a fairly expensive solution, as audio interfaces tend to get more expensive the more inputs you get. And I don't really recommend this if you primarily want to jam with your synth setup, but if you also intend to make music with a DAW and soft synths, having a good audio interface is actually the best solution for a more hybrid setup. Option B is to get a mixer with multiple inputs and an audio interface that lets you record the stereo output of the mixer. Now this will be less expensive but also less flexible, as you will end up with a stereo master recording and not individual recordings of each track or each instrument or synth in this example. Now we've come to option C and what I personally would get, and that is a mixer with multi-track recording capabilities. Multi-track recording means that instead of just recording in stereo, you're actually recording the individual tracks, and that lets you mix better later on in the process. And here, assume Live Track L6 or L6 Max are probably the best and most affordable options out there right now. You can record all tracks directly onto a micro SD card, and you can then later use that to mix the track if you want to. They also work as audio interfaces, meaning that you can use them to record directly into a computer as well. Let's talk about alternative setups. So if you like the idea of starting with a groovebox and want something a little bit more advanced than the circuit tracks, I would actually recommend the Digitakt 1 or Digitakt 2. And while the circuit tracks is more hands-on, it's more immediate, a bit more fun to start with, I think, it's less complicated overall. It only has 2 MIDI tracks, and if you want to expand your setup, the Digitakt 1 actually has 8 MIDI tracks, whereas the Digitakt 2 can have up to 16 on the Digitakt 2 if you want to. And yes, all of the previous choices that I've talked about for the circuit tracks work just as well for the Digitakt. For example, you can use the same synths, you can use the launch control to control it. In fact, you might even have more use for launch control with a Digitakt, because the Digitakt has more menus, meaning the launch control will give you hands-on controls over parameters without actually needing to go into that menu. So a launch control plus the Digitakt is actually an excellent combination. Now another option or choice you have is to start with a dedicated sequencer instead of a circuit tracks or a Digitakt. And there are so many to choose from. The Oxy 1, for example, then there's the Squarp Haypax, and then there's the massive Relic sequencer that I personally really like. There's the tiny Korg SQ64, which has been getting a lot of updates and is actually quite good now. And then there's also the KeyStep Pro and the BeatStep Pro. And if I were to recommend one, which is a little easier than the others, I would say that the KeyStep Pro is probably the way to go. It's very easy to use, it's beginner friendly. But very importantly, a sequencer does not make any sounds by itself, so you will need to add some sort of drum machine. I mean, you could use a sequencer and then a Digitakt or a circuit tracks as a drum machine. So you could basically start out with my setup ideas here, and once you really want to expand and be more do a more advanced setup, you could keep the circuit tracks or Digitakt as just instruments in the setup if you don't want to use them as brains, and add a more capable sequencer later down the road if you want to. Or you could get a TR-8S or TR-6S, or maybe a Korg Volca drum or Volca sample, for example. There are so many options out there when it comes to drum machines, but you will need some sort of drum machine. And a third option you have is actually to start with a workstation, an Akai MPC-1, for example, or Native Instruments Machine Plus, or a Synthstrom Deluge, serve the same function as the circuit tracks or Digitakt, but with far more capabilities. The reason why I don't recommend them as starting points for a beginner is that they're just far more complex. These devices can do everything from sampling to sequencing, making synth sounds, creating full songs on them, and even basic mastering and exporting the songs. So if you want a more music production focused Dawless setup, go with a workstation, but just know that it requires a lot more learning. Now let's talk about some other important things and some troubleshooting. There's two main types of MIDI connectors, DIN MIDI and TRS-midi. And to complicate things further, when you're using TRS-midi, there are two types of TRS-midi, type A and type B. Now type A is the most commonly used, but some devices uses type B and they're not compatible with one another. So if you have a device with a TRS-midi jack, make sure you have the right cable or a connector for it. And MIDI cables are always connected MIDI out into a MIDI in socket or a MIDI through to a MIDI in socket. So you never connect MIDI out to MIDI out. Also important to note is that when you're using a launch control or basically any MIDI controller, you need to make sure that it's sending the right CC value to the right MIDI channel. And then to make it even more complicated, on the device that you're sending the information to, you also have to make sure that the track has the right MIDI channel. But what if you have set up the right CC message on the MIDI controller, the right channel, the right MIDI channel on the MIDI controller, and the right channel on the receiving device, but it still doesn't work? Well, then you have to make sure that MIDI transmit and receive are turned on, usually on the receiving end, on the sequencer or device that you want to control. Other important settings are the clock and transport controls, and they often have options for internal or external sync, meaning that the synth or groovebox should sync its tempo to an external device and react to start and stop commands from an external sequencer. And this usually affects a lot of things in the synth or groovebox itself. For example, the ability to sync LFOs, for example, to tempo. Or if the synth has an arpeggiator and you want it to sync to an external sequencer, basically you need to turn on the clock sync. Some grooveboxes and synths, like for example the Electron devices, have dedicated on and off settings for the CC and program change messages, meaning that you have to turn on being able to receive CC or program change messages in the menus, otherwise a MIDI controller won't be able to control it. So this is something to keep an eye out for as well. So that was pretty much everything I had to say about building a hardware synth setup. Now I'm sure you have a lot of questions, so drop them down in the comments. And if you want to check out the gear, I've linked them in the description. And if you use my affiliate links, I do get a little % kickback without any cost to you, and it helps keep the lights on here in the studio. And as always, I hope to see you in the next video.